unexpected treasure. Unexpected treasure. That was the idea we were exploring in the All-Age Talk, inspired by Paul's image of treasure in jars of clay. He writes, "We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." Perhaps, like Paul, you have experienced God's all-surpassing power making a way when you thought there was no way forward. Or perhaps you're wondering what this paradoxical image is all about. What has treasure in clay jars got to do with me? Or perhaps you know what it feels like to feel like an ordinary clay jar, and you're listening because you want to know if it could be true that you're created to carry something of great worth. And if that's you, I'm so pleased you're listening. We're going to spend some time exploring that image this morning, and specifically how it relates to character. And there's a kind of a continuation on from last week when Mike preached on strength of character, on character. And we're looking at character again, but more specifically, we're thinking about humility. So our question we're asking is how might this image, treasure in jars of clay, help us cultivate, grow in humility? So humility is the big theme for this morning. I'd just like to begin with a disclaimer. I don't pretend to have any special knowledge about humility. We're all fellow learners here. Here's what I do have though. I have extensive knowledge of the opposite, of arrogance, pride and conceit. I've discovered them in my own life, and I've encountered them in others. I've wrestled with them, I've grieved them, I've seen them rip through relationships and create toxic atmospheres. I've heard, I don't know about you, have you heard of leaders, workplaces, schools, families, and dare I say churches that have been wounded by arrogance and pride and conceit? And so I speak as a fellow learner and as a beginner with all of this, but one who's convinced that there is something in today's image, picture, treasure in jars of clay that can help us as we pursue humility, as we pursue a Christ-like character. Just so you know that I'm headed somewhere, we're going to look at clay first, and then reflect a little bit about humility, then we're going to look at treasure, and then return to humility. So it's kind of clay, humility, treasure, humility. Does that sound okay? Just so you know, I'm not going to go somewhere different. So let's begin talking about clay and how it's okay to be clay. Throughout 2 Corinthians, Paul is again and again putting his hand up to say, yes, I've been through a hard time. Yes, I've got scars. Yes, I'm weak. And he owns that image. He leans into that image. He doesn't mind that he looks like a complete wreck when compared with the super apostles that were alluring the people of Corinth. And in our reading, Paul refers to himself and those that also work with him in the work of the gospel as jars of clay. He's not saying ornamental vase. He's not saying a precious metal chalice. He's saying clay, and that's okay. Paul doesn't need to portray himself as something that he's not, because he's not preaching Paul. He's preaching Christ, crucified and risen. Paul's not advertising his brand. He's speaking about who Jesus Christ is. And so Paul lets Jesus take the role of master, and Paul takes the role of slave. That's how he refers to himself, as a slave of Christ, with a whole track record of suffering for the cause. In those verses we just heard read, verses 8 to 9, Paul says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Paul's saying he's like a clay jar that's almost shattering, spilling its contents, yet somehow, by the grace of God, holding together, still holding the treasure. And for some of you this will resonate. You'll be thinking, I feel like that. I'm in that place. And for others of you, you'll be thinking, perhaps, this seems harsh. Paul's image here, it seems harsh. Why would he refer to himself as a jar of clay, or in older translations, an earthen vessel? This image, it has this rich scriptural background. If we think about Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we read of how the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, the earth, the clay, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then that verse we had earlier in our service, Isaiah 64 verse 8, we read, "Yet you, Lord, are our Father. We are the clay. You are the potter. We are the work of your hands." And I suggest that according to the Hebrew Scriptures, it's okay to be clay. It's okay to be clay. And we might like to think that we're a bit more than that. Yeah, I find it interesting that modern science tells us that we're made of the same atoms as everything else. Our atoms are just arranged differently. And the Bible has a way of saying this. In Ecclesiastes, in Genesis 2, all come from dust, and to dust all return. In some churches, actually, these words are said on Ash Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, as people receive the mark of the cross on their forehead with ash. With these words, "Remember that thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return." We don't have a service like that, but many churches do. And the idea is that we're all made of the same basic matter. The theologian Jürgen Moltmann sums this up by saying that we are both created imago Dei, in the image of God, as well as imago Mundi, in the image of the earth. Humanity doesn't stand outside of nature on like a higher plane, outside of the environment, but rather is an integral, though distinct member of it, both imago Dei and imago Mundi. As I was contemplating all of this talk of atoms and clay and dust, an image came to mind for me. I imagined a world-class tennis player mastering his or her technique on a clay tennis court. And I was thinking how, for a very few short years, a tennis player will be at the top of their game, receiving fame and wealth and honour. Yet they are made of the very same atoms as the clay on which they play. And they too will return to dust. And this is humbling stuff. You might want to say, but wait, aren't we spiritual beings as well as physical beings? I'd say, of course. But every time we try and divide physical and spiritual, we end up having a tendency to label spiritual as good and physical as bad. And we get ourselves in a mess because that's not the way God sees it. He called his physical creation good, even very good. And God the Son came in the flesh, atoms too, not as a disembodied spirit. And so our earthiness is something to embrace, not to shake off. It's okay to be clay. It's okay to be clay. Let's change gear and talk about humility. Our word humility comes from the Latin word for earth or soil, humus, which sounds like hummus, but mustn't be confused. Humility is literally about being grounded, reminding us that we're of the earth, we're of the dust, we're of the clay, and that it's okay. The Dalai Lama tells this true story of a big multi-faith conference that he attended in Beijing, China. And there were loads of religious people, leaders of many different religions. And this conference was so big that you had to have lots and lots of Chinese officials making sure things ran smoothly. And their faces were unnaturally stern, almost, these Chinese officials, making sure everyone was doing what they're supposed to do, and everyone was going where they needed to. And Dalai Lama tells about this moment when a big bowl of fruit, way bigger than this bowl of fruit, got knocked over. And fruit just went everywhere, rolling everywhere. And these Chinese officials started scrambling around on their hands and knees, smashing into each other as they tried to get the fruit back and get it all back in the bowl and prevent the chaos from happening. And sometimes something embarrassing like that needs to happen to bring everyone back down to earth with a thud. Perhaps you can think of people who need a bowl of fruit to go over to bring them back down to earth. Or maybe you need a bowl of fruit to go over. A bowl of fruit to be knocked over so you can remember that you're human, just like us all. I had a few fruit bowl moments on our wedding day, actually. Some of you will remember I tried to put my wedding ring on Jenny's finger, and then I tried to kiss her too soon, and they were my wedding day fruit bowl moments. And at the time I was so embarrassed, but now when I look back at it, I'm grateful for them because it got people laughing, and it made me laugh as well. And I think laughing at yourself is always a good thing, and actually integral to humility. Charles Spurgeon once said, "Humility is to make a right estimate of one's self." Humility is to make a right estimate of one's self. And this connects with what Mike was saying last week about character and that place of self-awareness in our lives. Humility is to make a right estimate of oneself. Perhaps then this right estimate begins with the recognition that we're all made of the same kind of stuff. What do you think? That no matter where we were born, or how much we have in our wallets, or what unique skills we possess or competencies we have, we're all made of the same kind of stuff. And I think this relates to how we see church as well. You know, we're at Worthing Baptist Church, we're not the most polished. We're not the most slick. We can actually be a bit messy and muddled at times, unlike some other churches. But we're all the churches, we're all just jars of clay learning what it is to carry treasure